This is a chance to talk to filmmakers who are actively engaged in the problems and pleasures and torments and delights of working in film and working in issues of social importance, all that that might mean. And I thought we might just start by having everybody in the panel just say how they got into making films. They're all at the Kennedy School. So this is both something they're doing in a serious way, but also something they're doing along with doing something else. So we've got lots of questions to ask, but just maybe if you, Juliet, if you want to just start and just say something about how you began to make films.
Right. So I started in front of the camera. I just fell in love with it, and I got lucky and did a very good production very early on in my career. I did something with HBO, Deadly Voyage. And even though it was a theater film, it tackled an issue that was pertinent. Some people tried to run away, stow away on a ship to Europe, and they were all mostly killed. And it was a big story. They were on their way to France, and it was quite a big story, and it changed my life. The whole experience, beyond meeting the stars, of course, and was transformational. And after that, I wanted to do good movies. I thought, I mean, Africa is abound with movies, but the quality sometimes is a little bit challenging. And so I thought, you know, I love this so much that I want to make it a career, and I want to control it. I want to be able to impact society. How do I do that? I just finished business school, and I thought I'm going to go back, start all over again, and get a degree in directing, and so I did. And that's how my career started.
Probably like many people in the audience, I just loved going to the movies as a child. I grew up consuming a lot of films. And so for me, it was originally a passion about being involved in the movies. It was the entertainment value. And I don't apologize for that. I still love the movies and still love all the same visceral thrills that we get when we go to the cinema and see a really great film. But after investing in and producing, I think, 8 or 9 narrative features with actors, and the kind of typical genres that you see, the typical subject matter you see in the independent film genre, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to take what I know about films and try and use the power of storytelling for issues of socially conscious or socially relevant issues. And the first opportunity I had, I just couldn't say no to. One of my employees pulled me aside and revealed to me that when she was an 11-year-old, she'd gone through a bad system of foster care families, ended up homeless, and later exploited, and was in the sort of kiddie prison at 12 years old. She was able to turn around her life in this truly remarkable way, going first to get her GED, then community college, then eventually graduating summa in mathematics from Fresno State, and then eventually getting a JD MBA. She buried that story, and she thought, I want to tell it, and I think film is the way to do it. Can you help me? So my first documentary feature was a short subject film about her story. And we enlisted Davis Guggenheim to produce it with me. Davis is the Academy Award winning director of An Inconvenient Truth and Waiting for Superman recently. And so that was my first foray in, and I was hooked. My last 3 films have all been feature-length documentaries.
Mine is a journey a little bit out of convenience and creativity, in the sense of this originally started with needing to write a research paper. And I said, I don't want to. So can I figure out a better way? Turns out that the medium of documentary filmmaking is much more compelling to tell the story, so I lucked out. But what it ultimately came down to is this past summer, I worked with Immigration Equality out of their DC office, and it was funded through the Carr Center for Human Rights. And we had to write a really big research paper on it. And I'd met various transgender clients of theirs. And I believe that transgender people are very misunderstood. And I just didn't feel like the story and the background and the history of what their clients were going through was going to be compelling enough to reach an audience and affect public policy, which is ultimately what we were trying to do through a 60-page paper. So I pitched to the Carr Center, can you support me turning this paper into a documentary? And lucky enough, I teamed up with a group called Harvard Law Docs, which the entire crew of Transgression is sitting in this row right here. And that's where I met them, through Harvard Law Docs. And they gave us funding, and they said, make this film. And so I am along with well, actually, our editor, TJ's had plenty of experience, but the rest of our crew, we're first-time filmmakers when it comes to documentary film. And it's by far it was the right choice to try to introduce this medium through documentary filmmaking. It's clear to me that the impact of Norma's story is going to be told in a much more effective and compelling way through this documentary. And so I just kind of put it out there and put the pieces together, and with the crew's expertise, we realized that we touched onto a story, a subject matter that was kind of on the pulse of something that wasn't being spoken about, but a lot of people cared about, and we received a lot of love and response as a result of it. And so now I'm at the School of Government, and maybe I should go to film school. I don't know. Maybe my life is changing. We'll see. No, but in all seriousness, that's that. Yeah.
My name is Talmage. I got into it a little differently. I came out of undergraduate with a degree in foreign affairs in Virginia, and I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And I went to a house one day, a movie house, and there was Days of Heaven was playing, Terrence Malick's film. And it just like changed my life. I watched one film, and I decided that one day I was going to write and direct. And it took me a while to do it, about 10 years, but eventually I started writing and eventually started shooting. I didn't do a documentary right off the bat, but when an opportunity came to do one on this gang of blind teenage boys in Buffalo who have kind of a street gang, I jumped at it. And it was really a fascinating experience because I was used to doing narrative film, writing. I was in Hollywood writing feature films and mostly comedy, drama stuff. And this film really changed the way I looked at filmmaking. It was still about finding the story, about discovering what characters wanted, what was standing in their way. But it was a totally different way of going about it, where you go off and you kind of immerse yourself in their world, and you see what comes of it, and you try to weave it into something that is compelling. And I found it to be a really great experience. So I'm kind of a convert to the documentary world, even though I still write narrative stuff. I think it has, by the way, just I think in general film has an incredible capacity to capture social injustice, unfairness, dilemmas. Just because storytelling is all about desire plus opposition. So great. Just in the clips we saw all kinds of great, concept. People wanted less crime, and then it was opposition. People wanted to just be themselves. It was opposition, and so it's really there's a distinction between the two, but really at the end of the day, we're telling stories that involve great desires and great conflict.
We can go in order, or we can jump in as you wish.
I'll take the bait. I actually think that filmmakers who become slavishly obligated to their cause do a disservice to their film. I think that the idea is that film can move people, and if you go too far outside the bounds of great storytelling, the things that work within the medium, you're at risk at losing your audience, and you're hurting whatever cause you're trying to promote by not taking advantage of the medium that you've chosen. So I think focus on the story, try and create a great film, and use that film as your ambassador to your cause. If it's just a film about the cause, I think it's very rare that it will be unusual to create a great film. So I think for any of you that want to move a cause forward, think the other way around. Film is going to be your vehicle.
For our film in particular, there was this amazing kind of crossing of paths between the responsibility that we felt to tell this film as a piece to affect public policy and to educate the community about what it's like to be transgender and to try to seek asylum into the United States. But other members of the crew wanted to represent different things, the creativeness of the story, Norma's story, to include, you could probably tell just from watching her sole story about what it is that took her journey to the United States is 1/1000th of overall all the things that she's been through in life. And we interviewed her from her childhood all the way to the moment she was living in that right now, and how do we choose which moments to use and which moments not to. And what we found in the end is if you kind of keep the film on a creative journey, but you still feel some commitment to the honesty of trying to make it an educational piece, especially with the purpose behind our film, we feel like we created a kind of a perfect mix there. And as a result, just to talk about the effect of public policy, Immigration Equality is now using our film and now the trainings to ICE officers. So Immigration and Customs Enforcement had no public policy in place about how to deal with transgender detainees. And as a result, they're now going to use the footage of our film to help illustrate the sensitivity that needs to be put forth to affect their policy towards transgender people. So it can be a tool for both, right? Education and creativity. So we had to find that perfect mix.
Yeah, I probably want to echo a little bit of what everybody's saying, but I think it kind of depends on what your goal is. If your goal is to create a piece of propaganda like Fahrenheit 9/11, then you go create a piece of propaganda that's meant to incite. If you're trying to draw people into being sympathetic for a cause that maybe you think that's more subtle, like this one might be an example, you might take a different tact where you want to really have people identify with the emotions of the human the human being in the story who's lived this through this situation. So I think you as a filmmaker, you always have to be thinking about what is it you're trying to communicate, what's your goal in a scene, in an act, in a movie. And until you answer that question, you don't really know exactly the tact you're going to take. I will agree also, though, with Chad a little bit, is that there is a tendency in the documentary cause-related filmmaking world to kind of end up getting a little preachy. And I think oftentimes those films could be well served by stepping back from the black and whiteness of the situation that the filmmaker might see because they believe so strongly on one side, and start to dig into the humanity. And I think those are generally where the greatest insights come. And you have to trust your audience that they're going to see what's going on.
Well, I can say for any of you that haven't seen Jesus Camp, Rachel Grady and Heidi Ewing's brilliant film about faith-based education, I think that's a perfect example. The people who are the subject of the film were thrilled with the way it turned out, the evangelicals who were featured. But other people who were really concerned about a move in homeschooled evangelical education pointed as, see, this is what we need to be concerned about. Rachel and Heidi got it just right. So both sides can watch the film, and you can decide how you feel about the issue. It deserved an Academy Award nomination and nominee, and it was one of the reasons why I think they're so popular now is this ability to sort of go in and let you view it without starting from a polemical point of view. Really, I think, smart way to make brilliant films.
And may I just add that I think that an important aspect is also not to take your audience for granted, because the audience is educated, the audience knows what it wants. So in as much as you're telling the human story and your audience wants to hear the human story, you shouldn't make your audience uncomfortable unless it's a technique you're using to make your audience uncomfortable, which then is part of your objective. So once you keep your audience in mind, you know whether you're trying to reach policymakers, whether you're trying to start a conversation in the population, whatever it is, your end goal kind of influences the technique that you use to make your movie.
So people have used the word story here about 220 times in the brief time we've been up here, and I wanted to talk about that for a second. And I'll back up. I was at a film festival in Jerusalem with a film that I'd made about government secrecy. This was in 2008, and I was at a dinner, and Ethan Bronner was at this dinner. Ethan Bronner was at that point the New York Times reporter for the Middle East. And I've been thinking about the relationship of documentary film and journalism. This is a kind of these are conflated ideas often. We often use them interchangeably. It's not really talked about very much explicitly, and I took the opportunity to ask Ethan what he thought the difference was, and Ethan says that he thought that journalism was the overarching rubric, and underneath journalism would be documentary filmmaking, journalism, memoirs, all kinds of nonfiction writing. And I said to Ethan, no, I don't think that's right. I said, I think that nonfiction is the overarching rubric, and underneath that is documentary filmmaking and journalism and memoirs, travel writing, The New Yorker, Vogue. And I mentioned this to Caroline Libresco at some point soon after that. Caroline's in the room, Sundance, a programmer, and somebody intimately involved with this event. And Caroline looked at me and goes, I don't think you're right. She said, I think that story's at the top, and underneath stories, fiction, nonfiction, Vogue, whatever kind of story you're telling is under this rubric of story. And this has the ring of truth to me. And I think since it's used so much now, I wonder, since everything can be a story, is it a category that actually means anything? And I wonder for you all, since you've all used the word sort of comfortably, I want to ask you what you mean by story. What do you actually mean by story?
I'll jump in here for a second. The story, when I use the word story, I believe that the team came to the conclusion that we were trying to tell Norma's perspective, Norma's narrative of what it is that she experienced. And from the beginning, we immediately got into a debate about what is our responsibility to the other side. I have no doubt that Immigrations and Customs Enforcement has a different take on what they think the experience is that transgender people go through. And as you watch our film, you will end up walking away thinking that the government is messing up and that what we are doing in the asylum process is unfair to transgender people. But there is another side to that. And I was thinking about that almost from a journalistic point of view. What is our responsibility to have some type of fairness, unbiased, and integrity to the other side? But we realize that's not what we're trying to do in our documentary. What we're trying to do is tell the story of Norma and the story of transgender detainees, and we still feel that we have integrity in that. We don't feel that we're creating a piece that's propaganda. We feel like we're creating an element, an SI, that is a story in and of itself, and then a separate documentary possibly could be made to tell the other side. But that's how we approach it. There's still a story to be told there.
I guess I might say that I'm kind of old school when it comes to story. I believe that if you look at storytelling from Aristotle through, all the way up to Joseph Campbell and then McKee and all those guys, like, we've kind of learned a lot about the structure of film storytelling.
I've never heard Aristotle and McKee said in the same phrase. That's really, that's just
Well, if you went to one of McKee's seminars, you would. He would say it about himself.
Well, exactly.
But it's and there are a lot of guys that talk about this. But film story. If we're talking about kind of 90-minute film story, it's a form, and whether it's a documentary or a narrative film, they tend, if you really break them down, to have a very similar structure, and there's a reason for that in the way that you hit beats, and it goes back to classical mythology about the hero's journey and the arc of that and the redemption that the hero finds in that. And in most, I think Jesus Camp is a great example. There are tons of great, there are many examples that if you pay attention to the fundamentals, you learn the fundamentals of storytelling, and each, a 10-minute film is different, it's like than a 90-minute film, but a 90-minute film, a feature film, has a very kind of specific rhythm to it. And I think you break that if you don't know that before you dive in, you might get lucky and make something great. I think some people have great intuition, but really studying story, understanding different characters' roles, understanding archetypes, understanding genre. These things are all things that play into either play in a narrative film, but also play equally into documentary film, but sometimes just in ways that aren't so obvious.
Well, I would just say, from my perspective, I think that human beings, we communicate in story form. I mean, before you started, you asked this question, you told us a story. When we're babies,
That's great.
exactly. Our parents tell us stories. In Africa, we sit wherever we come into a community and we tell stories. And so film is just an extension of that. It's an extension of expression. And for me, if you can find a connection between what you're trying to express and your audience, who you're trying to express it to, and find a coherent manner that you can communicate that so that your audience can understand what you're trying to say. So you are the sender, and you want to make sure that the message you're sending gets to the receiver in the way that you intended. And so there's a language that humanity and civilizations communicate with, and I think that it is that language that has been structured, in a sense, for film. And whether you're a journalist or you are a writer or whatever, there's a structure, or there's a way that you know that if I structure my dialogue, my audience will receive it in the way in which it's intended. And then you want to make sure that what you're communicating, they're open to receive what you're trying to tell them. And so long as you have those dynamics right and you have a balance, then I think that you are communicating in a way that is in a story form.
I'll just give one short example to maybe illustrate some points I think made by the other three panelists. One of my partners in crime, Seth Gordon, made a documentary film called The King of Kong. And for any of you that have seen it, you would probably agree that it is maybe the best comedic documentary of all time. With all due respect to Morgan, Super Size Me, and Bill the Story of Anvil, it is brilliant. And Seth will be the first to admit that he really kind of stumbled into something. It goes back to those elements that Talmage mentioned and that Juliet sort of illustrated. And that is the very structure of storytelling goes back to when we first communicated. His film was going to be about vintage video games and the people who still play them. Pac-Man, Galaga, and the epitome of all the great classic video games, Donkey Kong. That's the one. And so that alone might have been a cute story. He might have gotten lucky with a good story. But what he found were two archetypes. Steve Wiebe, this sweet, charming math teacher outsider in Seattle who dared to break the world record of Billy Mitchell, the epitome of all things evil, a barbecue salesman and liar from Florida who had dishonestly held the record for many decades. And what emerged was this incredible story. Instead of just classic video games, it became this story of good versus evil. And Seth will admit, I really just sort of stumbled into that. I had no idea that they were going to epitomize these archetypes. That created the brilliant story, and that's the biggest reason why King of Kong is as amazing a film as it is.
That actually, that story points out something very important, is once you kind of understand the fundamentals of storytelling, then when you go in to do a documentary, you're looking out for these things. You're looking, you're watching constantly to see these things come up. When I made this film, which we might see in a bit because the DVD wasn't working, but it was all I knew. I was asked to submit a project for a band called Interpol to do. They wanted to fund it. They just wanted to do a documentary. They asked me what I thought. I said, well, I heard there's this gang of blind teenage boys in Buffalo that get arrested for petty crimes and mischief. Let's go make a film about it. That was it. They bought that. So then I had to quickly think, oh, wow, we're going to go do this now. What's the movie about? And even before I met the kids, I realized, this is a movie, probably going to be a movie about being a teenage boy, and they just happen to be blind. And it's about longing and rejection and boredom and wonder and all these things. And once you start kind of, and then when we started shooting, you would see where the antagonism was, and it just kind of, it was amazing having been a narrative filmmaker then to jump into documentaries. And it was kind of a bit of a gift having studied that so strenuously to do, because it's very, feature films are very highly structured narrative films. So to then go into the documentary world and apply that was really kind of really enjoyable. And then just as Chad said, you start to discover all kinds of great things.
And just to build on to Talmage's point, the thing for me to note is not to become a slave to structure, because in trying to tell a story, you have to remain flexible. And one of the first lessons I learned is that in filmmaking, you plan, you do a storyboard, you do everything, and you go onto set, and nothing ever happens as you had planned it on paper. And so you have to be flexible and then tell the story as it happens. And if you're a filmmaker or you're a storyteller and you're looking at your audience and maybe your audience is not reacting, you tell a joke and they don't find it funny, and you have to be able to, change your style and change the story and change the structure, or else you become a slave to the technique of it, and then you've lost your ability to tell good stories.
So this being Harvard, it wouldn't be right to not ask the last two questions. One is about morality and one is about money. So the moral question being, when you're working in nonfiction, and often you're telling stories that are intimate to somebody's life, not yours, often people in desperate circumstances, not your desperate circumstances. You're making a film that is going to be something good for your career. You also care a lot about it, but you have multiple agendas. And you have to make a relationship with people, and you have to have a complex relationship. You want to be honest, but what happens if you discover something that makes them look bad, but it's fabulous for your movie? Or what happens if things go really badly and they don't really want you to film anymore, but you keep doing it anyway? Or even just how do you keep a relationship like this going? So this disparity of power that documentary filmmakers have with their subjects, this complex relationship, seems to me central to the activity, but not discussed so much. So I wondered if any of you have thoughts about that.
I would be surprised if we didn't all have thoughts about that. I mean, it's a real struggle when you're shooting and you're shooting a documentary and there's something very intense and emotional and personal. Somebody might be breaking down. Somebody's revealing something that they don't want to reveal, but you follow somebody around for a few weeks, night and day. Sooner or later, you're going to see things. My feeling is that there's Albert Maysles and his brother, they always talked about cinema verite, and they had a idea of the documentary was really just about putting the camera down and trying to have as little of a point of view as possible and letting the characters tell their story for good or bad. I'm not sure 100% that documentary filmmakers don't bring their point of view in. I think they usually do. I think it's pretty tough not to. So there becomes this kind of moment where you have to kind of figure out your own boundaries within the story you're trying to tell, or the lives that you're trying to reveal, or the circumstances that you want to expose, where you have to figure out where the line of integrity is between being honest and serving the subject and serving the goal of the film and being exploitive. And I think that's as much an art, far more of an art than a science, and part of the documentary filmmaker's challenge, I think.
We've had a moment, that exact crisis of conscience, or that moment of truth in Freakonomics. We did the last interview with Stetson Kennedy, who was a real pioneer in the civil rights movement, and then later was revealed as kind of a fraud. The work he did for civil rights is very real, but he did it through a series of supposedly first-person exposés of the Ku Klux Klan. It turned out later that although Stetson was the author, a lot of it was fabricated, and he was not a member of the Klan. He knew someone that was and took those stories. So the idea was the end, did it justify the means? We did this interview with him, and the way it would have played out had we used in the film the way it was imagined, I don't think it would have been the right way to cement his legacy. The power of storytelling cuts both ways. This man put together an amazing career of many, many decades, and I just didn't want the last piece, maybe the most powerful, lasting memory in this film, to be where he was sort of unmasked. And that was the whole idea, is this guy who's in the Klan, that we've unmasked him. It just seemed a little mean-spirited, and although I think we got the nuance right, I just felt that not everyone else would get it, and so we ultimately decided to keep it out of the film in many ways to kind of protect his legacy. But we're not journalists completely, at least I don't feel that way.
This particular topic, I mean, it's our first film that we made, and so I don't know how I would react differently in the future. We may have stumbled upon something that's so sensitive and so amazing that there are so many compelling moments that we could choose at times not to put something in that we thought would be hurtful to Norma. But nothing feels more awkward, at least as a first-time filmmaker, when I see her crying, and on the inside I'm like, good. And that was the most awful feeling. I mean, I felt like an awful human being in that moment, because I knew that for the film that was going to be so great, and so great for the people trying to build sympathy and love for her. But on the inside, she's hurting, and I know that that's good for our film. And just out of respect, we kept a lot out because Norma still hasn't completed the asylum process. And in her telling her story, certain things about her past that led her to come into the United States would be amazing for our movie. But we knew that might not look very good for her. And there was a certain trust that I just felt a certain obligation to her to not put certain things in the film that I felt could hurt her in her life. And I know that many other films won't put me in that position. But this particular film, we actually made a lot of those choices to exercise power very carefully and thoughtfully in that way.
Mm. Well, I would say that for me, it's an ongoing communication. It's an ongoing development growth process. And it is something that every filmmaker continues to go through and will continue to go through. And as soon as you lose that touch, I think as a filmmaker, you're going downhill. And to the extent that the movie you make and the subjects that you choose is a reflection of possibly where you are as a filmmaker, there's a little bit of you in every subject that you choose to treat. I mean, for instance, when I met Ajua and decided to do her story, I saw a little bit of me in there And so long as the movie, the subjects you treat is a reflection of you, it will also reflect your level of maturity, your level of morality, the conflicts you have within you. And so long as you continue to have that dialogue with yourself and people you trust and love, and the subject of your film, I think that you are having an interesting conversation. So it would be difficult for me to stand here or sit here today and say that this is what I would do. I think every situation is different. I might choose in a certain scenario that this is relevant, critical to the piece I'm doing. And if this portion is not in there, it won't happen. And so I might, say to the subject that I'm sorry, you don't want this to be in the movie, but it is going to be in the movie. And in certain circumstances too, you feel that it's not critical to the storytelling process, or that you can tell that we have tricks that you use. You can tell the story, or you can imply something without necessarily implying it right there. And we use those tricks all the time. And I think that that's a conversation that the filmmaker will have to have with themselves.
I think the question I was going to ask, the money question, was whether it's possible to be a filmmaker. Can you sustain yourself and make a living? Do you have to be born rich? Do you have to have another job to do it? That was going to be the question. But we can answer that question if it interests you. I think we're moving on to the Q&A in any case. So if that's a question you want answered, then you can ask it. But I think we'll move on to the Q&A part of this moment. So who's brimming with questions now? And we're going to sit here and, yes, please. Somebody if you can stand up.
Yeah.
We have a microphone.
Oh, we have a mic here.
In which case, you don't have to stand up.
I have a couple of comments and then a question. In the movie, the first movie that we saw, I realized that you showed the polio stuff to say, correlation is not causation. But I think I saw Salk there. And as opposed to him being kind of a laughable figure, he's actually a very important figure in terms of saying that he was not going to patent that vaccine. And he was not going to make $1 zillion, but that vaccine, he said, can you patent the sun? It's an important public interest story. In terms of another quick comment, I was wondering I was wondering like everybody else what the answer was, but also what counts as crime. I think is a very important question. I don't know how much you get into that in the movie, but people like the head of Massey Energy who murdered 29 people and is walking around a free millionaire, for example. The question is, you said about the Jesus Camp movie that both sides saw it and they were happy, but I'm wondering if both sides can see the story. I didn't see that movie. And be happy. What has the filmmaker really said?
Do you want to take this one, Talmage, or should I? Let me go ahead and get this one. We'll kind of go in order. I think Jonas Salk is a perfect example for some of the large big pharma companies that need to think about their responsibility and a double bottom line on making drugs available as cheaply or, if possible, free. And you're right, we use that only to talk about mistaken causation and correlation as a setup to what was the final piece of the puzzle in violent in crime. The crime drop is very simple: violent crime. So murders and aggravated assault, all the kind of categories you think about as violent crime. And it's a pretty unimpeached part of Steve Levitt's background as an academic. He posed all this stuff now almost 10 years ago with John List and some other economists, and I think many of you know the big reveal. And maybe if we have time, it's just 3 or 4 more minutes left in that segment, we could show it. The big reveal is this: the unimpeachable link between the legalization and of abortion and the ready availability of abortion. So whether you're pro-choice or pro-life really doesn't matter. It's a clear and unimpeachable link, the availability of abortion and the drop in crime. And the idea is pretty simple. Unwanted children of any socioeconomic group are more likely to commit crimes when they reach the crime age. And peak crime age is between 16 and 25. And so when unwanted children are less likely to be born, there are cohorts of children that would have been in the likely to commit crime category that simply don't exist. And that's why we chose to use animation and the story of It's a Wonderful Life. If the last 3 or 4 minutes you finish, we bring it all back. And you remember George has this big moment where he realizes, you know, that he is alive and he gets to sort of live out the rest of his life in that way. And they simply weren't born. So it's not in any way an advocacy of abortion. It's also not in any way a demeaning of any group. It affects all groups pretty equally. It's just that wanted children are far less likely to commit crimes than unwanted children, no matter how they're born or not born. And Levitt was able to prove it because, as many of you know, historically, abortion didn't become legal in every state at the time of Roe v. Wade. It was already legal in several states. And so those violent crime drops happened those times abortion became legal in those states. And you just look at it on a map and it's as clear as anything. And then he goes through and shows the causal links. But so that's, I think, that's it. Was there one more piece? Oh, and Jesus Camp, I can do this one simply. I think a filmmaker has a responsibility to tell a great story, and you get the story of Jesus Camp brilliantly. So I think that's the responsibility. Heidi and Rachel have a point of view. It's pretty strongly one side or the other, you might guess. I think they were a little shocked to see that my county, which is featured in the film, Jackson County, Missouri, the largest urban county in the United States, the highest percentage of homeschooled children of any urban county in the United States. Almost all those children are homeschooled because the parents believe the schools are too secular. So this was a way to look at those families and why they made the decision to pull their children out of school, to homeschool them with a faith-based education. So the Jesus Camp people think that's great, that's right, we pull them out. We don't teach them to pledge allegiance, we teach them to pledge allegiance to Jesus. All that's exactly how they believe. Heidi and Rachel did that perfectly. And if you want to draw the conclusion that that's a problem, or that maybe that's something that should be evaluated, I think it's a more honest way to do it than to treat them like they're just some alien farm animals, or to do it as a polemic. And I won't, but I could name some films that I think have taken a very mocking look at people that are different than maybe most of us. And I don't think that's effective filmmaking.
There's also a point, a very important point in your question. You said if both sides see themselves and are pleased with the film, what has the filmmaker achieved? I think it's very difficult to set out, if you set out to make a film to change the world, I feel like that's a bit of a trap. In general, I think you want to tell a story about a person or a group of people, and you want to kind of expose the audience to a new idea. To me, it's more about exposing than convincing, because once you get into the convincing mode, you often get into the pedantic mode, and then you get into the boring mode, and then people walk out and go get some popcorn. So it's a little tricky to say that it's black or white like that. I know Rachel and Heidi very well, and they have great integrity, and they do have a really strong point of view on this. I actually thought it was a real achievement that you could capture a group that had such a strong position as the pro-Jesus guys, the Christians, and capture them in a way that they felt that they had been, I think is a true testament to their filmmaking skills, that they were able to capture those guys in a way that made them feel like they'd been honestly portrayed. Because now we can have a conversation about that.
Right. Good questions. Thanks.
Thanks for the panel. I'm Rishi. I'm a consultant working here, but now I'm touching on making a documentary, probably narrative documentary. It's about young people from emerging countries studying and working in the States. I'm one of them. I want to capture these communities' voice and capture how these time affect on them. As a very beginner, I have two questions in my mind. So first, you all mentioned audience in the mind. So I want to know, when you make a documentary, what kind of audience you have in mind, and how do you define your audience? And secondly is that whether a documentary has to take a stand, because there's always two sides or several sides of the story. Do we have to tell, really express an idea in our mind, like kind of my idea or what idea? So that's the two questions I have. Thank you.
Okay, I'll talk. Just for a sec. Just to say quickly that it's interesting in fiction, when there's conflict, we think of that as a story, but in documentary, when we call differing views balance, and as if balance means neutered. I think in documentary, when you are able to present sides, that's the kind of conflict you're presenting. it's not the kind of journalism, some people think this and some people think that, otherwise we can't publish it. It's really saying, what's complex about the story? What's complex about the thing I'm looking at? Things are rarely one thing. If you think of it like that, then maybe you're not sort of undoing the film before you start. Sorry, Juliet.
Now, I'm just going to build on your point and say, and bring journalism into the picture. So if you're going to write an article or you're going to write an op-ed or whatever, you're thinking, am I going to present a problem-solution situation, or am I going to put something forward that will start a dialogue? So you have to decide what you're doing from the word go. Are you going to say to people, this is me? Are you, the filmmaker, going to be in the picture? When I say be in the picture, are you going to reflect your own opinions and say, this is a problem, I think society should address it this way, or present several solutions and say society can look at it in these various ways? So there's so many ways you can tell the same story, right? You have to determine what your end goal is. Are you wanting society to start a conversation that is part of a bigger conversation, or there's an issue that you want to bring attention to and you want actual work, policymakers to take note, and you want something to come out of that? So once you have that conversation with yourself, then it's better to determine how you make the film. For instance, you may decide, do you want to appear in the film yourself? Do you want to tell the story? Do you want your subject to tell the story? What it is that exactly what you want to achieve. Those are things that would affect the kind of technique that you use to tell your story.
If you had an opportunity to get the other side, whatever the other side would be in your story, I don't see what the harm would be to at least create the dialogue and get a good sense of where they are coming from. In our case, that other side would have been Immigrations and Customs Enforcement. And we reached out to them several times, and they declined any interview that we wanted to have with them, and they wouldn't meet with us either. I have no doubt that if we had met with them and we had heard their perspective on it, we weren't looking for evidence to further prove that Norma is right in terms of where she's coming from. We wanted to represent the complete story. We wanted to show that conflict. And had they spoken to us, they most likely would have been in the film, and we probably would have just represented them very accurately for where they were. But they didn't. And as a result, the story seems to heavily skew towards being sympathetic to Norma. And so I would just say that if you had the opportunity to reach out to the other side, understand the other side, and it didn't take up too much more of your time and your budget, I don't see why it would hurt, because Juliet said earlier, sometimes you can't plan. You gotta go where the story is taking you. And I certainly feel like the story might have gone in a different direction had we seen and heard clearly what the other side felt about it. But it didn't, so we have the story that we have.
You know, can I just say one thing about that? Is that, you know, if you get the other side of the story and it somehow destroys the side of the story that you've been telling, then you weren't telling the right story. You know, I think that when you get both sides, the truth starts to kind of be inescapable. And if you're on to the right thing, then it's only going to reinforce in general. Yeah.
Let me give you a little practical advice too. If you're tracking a story or multiple stories, track more people than you think you're going to use in the film. I know it's a little bit more expensive, but I think as a practical matter that will work out much better for you. It's hard to know where the story will lead, and you may get one person who emerges and has more interesting things cinematically, and other people that may drop out of the film altogether. So if you can afford it, try and track multiple people.
Let me say one other thing, which is that it's very important for filmmakers to have a very strong idea going into the project, but have to know that that strong idea is the point of departure, not the point of arrival. And to not think that you actually know what the film is and you work backwards from that conclusion, like the war in Iraq. That there's other ways to think about it, and that documentary films the world is incredibly complicated and not knowable ahead of time, and that your job as a documentary filmmaker is to put yourself sort of and have the sort of world come at you and see it as well as you can and adjust. I mean, as people have said all along. And that's the pleasure of making a documentary film, not lining up your ducks to support a previously held opinion. Like, who cares?
I'm stealing that. That's perfectly stated.
One final thing to your question. You were saying kind of of audiences and how do you kind of go into the project. I think it's really important to kind of think about to learn from what others have done. And this is good advice for anybody that's a writer or a director, is watch a lot of documentaries. you know, and start to learn from what other people have done and kind of break down, watch them over and over again, and watch them in slow motion, watch them backwards. Like you'll start to see things happening. And so when you talk about that, you know, what are some tips for doing your first one? I would say first start out by kind of learning a bit of the canon if you can.
Quentin Tarantino, when he became the star at the Sundance Film Festival with Reservoir Dogs, when asked where he went to film school, he said, "I didn't go to film school. I went to films." And it's a little smug, but he meant it. He consumed the canon, and you see it influence his work.
Thanks. I spent 3 nights at the Nobel Lectures this week, and it was with Helen Whitney. So you probably know who she is. I think just on this point, I was so impressed with the amount of work that she put into every single one of her documentaries. Exactly what you said. The idea was a starting point, and then she usually had some revelation along the way that caused her to, you know, change the whole thing. I mean, thousands of hours, weeks, and obviously she must have had a lot of money. But what struck me the most about watching these snippets and excerpts of these docs that she made was how it was about people's stories and people who otherwise would never have had the chance to tell their story, and how earlier someone talked about the loss of the art of, or the capacity for people to tell their stories, and how much most of these people had suffered and were traumatized and never healed because they had never had a chance to tell their story, whether they were homosexuals, whether they were people who had suffered from violent childhoods, whether they were people who, cover the gamut. I'd like to hear from you what you think about what we can do as a society to give more people, create the conditions for people to tell their story. You are all in a position, film all the documentary, people who want to make documentaries are there to help people tell their story, but is there anything that we can do beyond that? And I guess a secondary question would be, documentaries aren't mainstream yet. How do you get to more people? How do we build a bigger market so that you guys and gals who are telling these really important stories that need to be heard get to more people?
2 years ago, I had the opportunity to talk about women's contribution to global security at a conference that was happening in Denmark. And for me, it was a privilege to talk about how women had used the mobile phone to kind of capture the people who were raping them, to even try and testify in law courts when they couldn't travel. And for me, that was such a strong story of how society can use technology. I mean, talking about in Africa, for instance, mobile phone, the impact of mobile phone is huge. People have more mobile phones than they have television. People have mobile phones than they have electricity. I mean, it's amazing. And people are constantly using that tool to be able to express themselves. And so I think that that's a dialogue that we can continue to have. And you would know better the technological advancements here and the opportunities that are here, and how people who don't have access can be encouraged to use tools that are available to them in that way. One of the first lessons I learned in school was, if you want to make a film, go make a film. So the theory is important. You can learn all the theory, but you never know till you really get out there. And so it's interesting that those who are using these tools, whether it's self-made videos, it's amazing what they are learning and how they are communicating, coming back to the story, telling the human story. I have something I want to express. Talmage said earlier on that if you're starting a movie or project and your idea is that I'm going to change the world, then you're starting from a wrong premise. Your idea is to communicate. Your idea is to express. And so when people are made to understand that the tool we have is to express, to be able to communicate, it's a communication tool, then we can begin to have that impact, and people will feel less scared, thinking that I don't have the technical skills to be able to communicate. And I think that that's the way to go. In Africa, at least, it's having great impact economically, socially, all different aspects. And I think that there's a lot of it that is here. And interestingly, even though the technology comes from here, it's not being used as much as it's being used in developing countries. And I think in that direction, there's a lot that the developed world can learn from the developing world.
And I'd say for getting a bigger audience, we need to make better films, and people who love documentaries need to evangelize for them. Tell people you love going to docs, and we should vote with our feet and our dollars.
Occupy Yale in the background.
Along those lines, it sometimes seems like the only documentaries that receive wide distribution are more sensationalist pieces, like Michael Moore's being the obvious examples. And I was wondering if you, as working within the industry, feel like there's the same sort of bias in the distribution system, and how you think that affects the strength of documentaries and people's general perception of it.
I don't. I really don't. I just, it's hard to predict what people will like, but I don't think there's, especially now, the films are available. They're out there. I don't feel like there's any real prejudice from the distribution companies. They're agnostic. They want films that will attract audiences. Michael Moore is a category of one.
Yes, that's right.
He's not a documentarian. Whether you think of him as a good filmmaker or a bad filmmaker, he is unique in and of himself. So I think this is a fairly golden era of documentary films. I think the last 3 or 4 years have been pretty superb.
Yeah, and more than the last 3. I mean, it has to be said, 15 years ago, you did not see documentaries on the big screen. You can now see 20 of them. I mean, there's Netflix. There's all kinds of ways to get distribution to see films. Right. Documentary films are seen more widely now than I've ever seen, ever in the since the beginning of cinema in the 1910s. Yeah. So I mean, it's worth thinking that we want more, and we do. But it's also worth noting that it's much, much better. It's also worth noting that tons of women are making films. I mean, it's now. It's not even something to discuss exactly. And documentary filmmaking, women making documentary films is huge.
That's right.
But the reason for that is because there's no money to be made in documentary films.
Or for me either.
And it's sustainable.
Well.
So the stakes are much lower, and that's why women occupy more.
I've made money in every documentary film I've ever made.
Well, very lucky.
But it's a good point. I don't know if people could hear. Caroline's point is that women are making documentary films because there's no money in documentary films. And there's some deep truth to that. And then there was a rejoinder that every film that Chad has made money. And Caroline said he's lucky to do that, and that's true.
And there definitely feels like there may be some subtle or maybe not so subtle gender discrimination against women making bigger budget narratives. There just aren't very many. Hurt Locker took forever to get made, and I think everybody knows the dirty little secret was there was questions. The director who had her moment early might not be able to pull it off. So I think documentary films tend to be a little bit more egalitarian across all kinds of things: race, gender, socioeconomic class. So I do love that documentary films seem to be more open to more kinds of folks. But I don't want to say that there's no money in documentary films. I think that's a little off base.
But beyond making money, the previous questioner talked about a tool. I think that a lot of women see this as an opportunity, as a tool. And if there's a tool in which I can express myself, if you're in a society or in a community where there's a problem, you can't express yourself, and suddenly there's an opportunity for you to do that, either to capture someone who is someone who is raping you, or someone you can testify, or just to tell a story about your situation where you are, get to share it. I think that that's an amazing tool, and women having had that opportunity in a while, and suddenly there is this opportunity, and it doesn't have to be too expensive, and women are taking advantage of that. I learned a word during the J term recently that said syzygy, where you get to a point where you find an alignment, you discover an alignment between what you want to express and the world, and taking opportunity, taking that advantage. And I think that women are in a unique position to take this tool and make the rest of the world listen to what women want to talk about, and all minority groups. And I think we are taking that.
All marginalized.
Right.
You're finally getting a voice.
Absolutely. Right.
I think we have time for one more question, but this will be it because we're actually out of time. So one more question and pithy responses.
Hi, my name is Marla, and I'm a genie at the cottage. My My question is that one mark of a documentary film is that it has a reaction. And sometimes these reactions are positive, but often they're negative. How do you deal with this criticism, and how do you find the separation between what you're doing a documentary on and what your message you're trying to say there, and how you put it together as a filmmaker?
Who's caught some grief for the movie?
I have. I've read some pretty negative reviews of some of my films. That's no fun, but I don't really think much about it. It's a completed work of art, and I don't think it has any influence for me on future films. So I read everything, the positive and the negative. I read what the critics write.
I read the negative more quickly, though.
and fewer times.
At fewer times, exactly.
But you know, if you're not pissing somebody off, you're probably not doing your job. And so I think if you have integrity in your viewpoint and you've really thought your way through the issue or the issues, then hopefully some people will take some exception to it. You don't want to just make a film that everybody just goes like, okay, fine. So conflict in film and conflict as people watch film is probably a positive thing, and it's probably a good sign. So I don't know. I think when you're making a documentary, you go for it. You think where your level of where your integrity lies and what you're trying to do. And then when people take exception to it, then the conversation starts, and that's kind of awesome.
And you can draw a line between where no criticism is bad criticism, right? If you want attention on your project and people are talking about it, to some extent is good. You can take advantage of that. And then you can look at it from the point of view of an artist, where this is a part of you you've put out there and people are criticizing it and you're sensitive, but then you have to dust yourself off and move on. I mean, one of the things I don't like to do is watch myself on film, because I think I look awful. Well, on film. But then I do it every time because I can't imagine life without it. And so once you can get to that point where you're doing something, you can see the impact, and you want to continue to do that, and you get satisfaction from that. I mean, people always have their opinions, but opinions are not facts. And being able to take in what you can take in and let go when you should let go, I think is the key.
We have time for one more question.
Is this on? Hi, I have a comment and a question. My comment is that I think without Michael Moore, none of you would be sitting here. No one would care. He was not a sensationalist. He sold tickets, guys. He made money, which you're a Hollywood writer. I come out of Hollywood and documentary both. The use of story is conflict is good versus evil. The vast majority of documentaries that any of you know, have heard about, or are wanting to make films for are because they are about the fight of good and evil, and the filmmaker took one side. There are plenty of stories and issues where there is not two sides, and in fact, a balanced, boring subject that has such even sides, you aren't going to want to see that. So I would say, for example, your immigrant story is incredibly moving and powerful, because how can there be another side? The immigrant officials even know that. So I just wanted to say that to any of you who are thinking about documentaries, they are a long time, I'm on the side of right, you're on the side of wrong, tool for activists of many different stripes. And so I don't think the Chief said that. My last question would be, can you talk about financing, and how do your financiers, your sources of financing, if at all, influence your content? In the moral sense of the word, actually, not how the story gets told.
I'm my source of finance, so I have a pretty big influence on me. But I've had investors in my films. I'm usually the majority investor in my early films. I invested in someone else's project, and I'm very much a patron of the arts. There were never any strings attached to any check I've ever written, and in fact, I think one of the reasons why I was sought out for future investment was not the fact that I was willing to write a check, but that it came with absolutely no strings. Not even just a political point of view, but I trust the artist's vision. That's why I'm investing. I don't want to corrupt it in any way. And with my own films, I've had some minority interest partners, but I treat them that way. I treat them as equal partners, even if I'm the one putting up the bulk of the money. And I still think Michael Moore stands alone. I'll share my bias. I think his films are wonderful. They've fallen off a little bit, but to me, he is not. I don't feel like we're branches off of his tree. I'm Errol Morris and Pennebaker and a bunch of other people, and I don't see the films that I make really connected to him. As much as I like him and think he's valuable, no one's been able to imitate him. He just sort of stands alone. If you look at his numbers of his films, they're not like anything else in the space. He's a sort of one of a kind, good, bad, and different. And I think he's an important part of of film over the last 2 decades. But I think we're kind of disconnected. Morgan had one very profitable film, and I produced one of Morgan's movies. He made one very profitable film, Super Size Me. But just the one, and it was a kind of shot in the dark, and it was Michael Moore-like, although with a bigger smile and a cool mustache and a cool goatee.
Yeah.
I think you'd be making a mistake to just focus on one filmmaker as kind of representative of any genre, because it's a huge. A lot of films are made every year, and documentaries go back to the very beginning of the Méliès brothers, and to say that Michael Moore is the only thing that people should be thinking about, I think they're like, you're skipping over a ton of really important filmmakers, and knowing Michael Moore is important, but knowing the Maisels is important, knowing Pennebaker is important for documentary. I'm not a documentary expert. I think Ross might be able to add a few more names to the list, but I wouldn't reduce it down to just one.
So this has been great, and it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be with the panel. Join me in thanking the panel. And thank you all for showing up.